Welcome tonight to this program, our Meet the Author event with Tamim Ansary, who I met last year after I received a phone call from General Tony Zenny. And he said, "I've got a book you have to read." And he came and he spoke on his first book, Destiny Disrupted, the history of the world through Islamic eyes. And I said, this is really something. I wish the whole American population could read it so you'd really understand how, 1.3, 1.4 billion citizens of this world view our world's history. Please, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Tamim Ansary.
Well, first of all, let me just tell you guys, by way of introduction, that my father was one of the first Afghans sent to the United States to study. He married my mother. She was the first American to marry an Afghan and go back and live in the country with him. And she was there for 22 years, so I grew up in Afghanistan until I was the age of 16. Then I came to the United States. I've been here ever since, but I went back right after 9/11, after the Taliban were driven out, and I went back last spring. So with that bit of context, now let me tell you what I want to do tonight. I want to take you into 3 periods of Afghan history. And first I want to take you into Afghanistan, let's say in the 1770s or so, which not coincidentally, or actually quite coincidentally, happens to be about the time that the United States was first taking shape. Then I want to take you to the 1880s and 90s, a 20-year period that's interestingly pivotal, and then I want to come into today. Okay, so 1770s, Afghanistan was an empire, it had an emperor, but let me just say that the territory of Afghanistan was actually inhabited kind of like by a hodgepodge of clans and tribes, and the country was really what I've called in my book a universe of village republics. And most of the people lived in these small villages, I'd say 300 to maybe 1,000 at the most of them near these rivers that crisscross Afghanistan. And most of them, they were sort of autonomous in how they lived. And the question of, let's say, crime, justice, any kind of laws was decided right there in the village by this village council. The village council was not a appointed or constituted body. It was just the guys of the village getting together when something came up. Of course, there were people with more authority and people with less. But the authorities were either the elders or the clerics. And the elders, which doesn't really mean they were old. Actually, that's an English translation of that Farsi or Pashto word. The literal translation is big guys. So there were big guys and littler guys. Although because age is this incredibly respected thing, there was a tendency for elders to be older, but forget about that for the moment. Okay, so there were elders, and usually in a village somebody was officially the malik, the mayor kind of figure. But the maliks were not exactly appointed, and they weren't exactly elected. They just kind of emerged, and so did the big guys. And how did they emerge? What made somebody one of the big guys? Well, there is a complex fabric of social etiquette and cultural network of rules that those who play it well end up being more prestigious, and those who play it not so well kind of sink down. It's true that if your father was an important guy, you have a leg up. It's true that if you if you've performed great deeds in some way or another, that'll give you a leg up. It's really important that you have displayed abundant and reckless generosity. That'll give you a leg up. It's also the case that marriage alliances mean a great deal. So who you're connected to through your network of family connections, that's really important. And how do those take place? That's in the hidden world of the women. The women are really in control of weaving together these marriage alliances. Now, the other kind of figure that was important in this world is the Mullah, the cleric. There's various levels of cleric in Afghanistan, but the Mullah is is the all-purpose, ground-level Islam in action in everyday life. And so any village would have at least one mullah, maybe more than one, and at least one mullah imam, which is the guy who takes care of the mosque. So if the village, every village would have something that was mosque-like. It might just be a bigger building, it doesn't necessarily have tile work and all that. But every village has a mosque, and that's where people meet for the jirgas, and that's where if travelers are coming by, the village will put them up for the night in the mosque. And so the mosque is a community hall, village meeting house, and all that stuff. And the mullah is the mullah imam takes care of the mosque. And then these mullahs, they perform all kinds of rituals and functions of daily life that Islam says you have to have. For example, if a kid is born, then the mullah has to come in and whisper a little thing in his or her ear that says, welcome, you're part of the community now. And it's a religious, it has the, I don't want to say it's religious exactly, because in Afghan culture, everything is sort of religious. Everything's part of the same. There's no secular realm as opposed to the religious realm. It's all kind of one thing. So whispering into the ear of this child, presiding over the contract when there's a marriage, washing or saying the prayers for the dead person who's lowered into the graves, all of that kind of stuff, plus anything that's like book learning or education, that's provided by the mullah. Every Friday, it's the mullah who stands up in front of the group and leads the prayer. Not like I'm doing now, like this. Everybody faces the same way. The mullah is just like the conductor, he's just setting the rhythm of the prayer. And so, but because he is the guy who definitely knows how to read the Quran and supposedly knows about the rules of the religion, and therefore can give advice on any thorny matter when people want to figure out if this is right or that's right. Does this guy really owe a cow for a sheep? Well, you can look it up. It's in the book someplace, and the mullah knows what Islam says about that. Okay, so the mullah, education, law, those guys had control of that realm. So the question is, how does the mullah get to be a mullah? Well, those two, they just emerged. They emerged from below. And what happened is, if you're inclined to be a mullah, you go hang out with the mullahs when you're a little boy. And, the mullah, because there's a bunch of these little boys, he assigns them chores. He says, you do this, you do that. And gradually they pick up the lore and some simulacrum of religious education there. And one day, probably a kid is born and the mullah is out of town. The people say, well, how about that other guy that's been hanging around? Let's get him. So he comes in, and then after that, people tend to think of him as a mullah. So it's just like that, these mullahs just kind of rise. And there are higher figures than mullahs, qazis, judges, those are respected big guys with a lot of authority. In the traditional world of Afghanistan, who appoints them? Nobody appoints them. Amongst the scholars and learned and the mullahs and stuff, the sense of prestige gravitates to some people. They are come to be acknowledged as more and more learned. And so the whole network of these religious, clerical, fabric just develops these nodes, and they're qazis, and there was only a few of them. And they would preside over anything that has to do with a dispute between between two villages or something like that. So I'm trying to give you a picture of a world in which the real leaders of the country are not appointed or elected by anyone. They just emerge, and the process by which power is negotiated is very akin to how it is in a family, how it is in a extended family, and perhaps to some extent, if you guys went to high school, how it is that somebody is the leader of the gang when you're in high school. They don't exactly appoint or elect those guys. After a while, you just kind of know who's a leader. So it's like that. And what that means, however, is that anyone who has power can also lose power by blowing it in some way, by doing something that violates the norms or just speaks poorly at a meeting or whatever. You have this universe of village republics. They know about each other. There is nomads that pass through, and there are these feudal villages that are kind of like the little villages writ large with a wall around them. And there's caravans that take goods back and forth through there. So who is the emperor? The emperor is a guy whose network of personal connections that considers him to be powerful, respectable, honorable, and important are that network of people who themselves are considered important in their little realms. You see what I mean? And in 1770s, this period that I'm talking about, there was an Afghan tribal leader who did what many Afghan tribal leaders before that had done. He emerged, he was powerful, he got the tribes together, he flung together an army, he went to India, he conquered it, he sacked it, he got the treasures out of the temples, he brought it back, and he distributed the gains to his supporters. They liked that, so there was more supporters, he got more armies, he went down, he sacked it again, he brought more treasure back. India is Hindus, and this guy is a tribal leader in a resolutely, doggedly Muslim world. So for him, anything he does that's warlike and goes and fights people who are not Muslims adds to his prestige. So even though the tendency of Afghan culture is to dissolve into the level of the clan, not even the tribe, the clan, not even the clan, the extended family, no, not even the extended family actually, the individual. It's just got this impulse towards fragmentation down to the level of the individual. But Islam being this pervasive ideology, the way that people hold the society together is by proving themselves as mighty Muslims. And as long as he was out there conquering, both of those things were happening. He was fighting for the faith, and he was bringing in money. That cycle. Well, his empire fell apart. All of these empires fell apart, and they fell apart in part because there was no sense in which that guy or his successors or the ones that came slightly later really governed the country. What would government mean? They maybe repaired the highways a little bit, and they enforced weights and measures in the marketplace. But aside from that, mainly they gathered armies, they went conquering, and they came back. And in that Afghanistan, that empire that was then for the first time known as Afghanistan, it wasn't really distinct where the borders were even. It wasn't like you could go to some place and say, now I'm in Afghanistan, now I'm not. Within Afghanistan, many currencies were in use. It wasn't, it didn't have a national currency, many different languages. Many people never heard really of the emperor. He didn't handle education. He didn't handle law. So, how was he he was an emperor, but he was not a king. Okay, so now in the next 60, 70 years, something that happens twice is that the British come in and occupy Afghanistan. And each time they do, they are coming in on a country that some big tribal guy has managed to coalesce into some kind of a unified territory. And each time that the British come in, they did it in 1939 to 42, and then they did it again in 79 to 80 or 78 to 80 in that period. So each time they came in, and it had to do with political jockeying with the Russians, it didn't really have anything to do with Afghanistan. But each time they came in, they unseated the guy who was the king of Afghanistan, and they put in somebody that they felt would be more compliant and more favorable to their needs and interests in the larger global picture. And here's the mistake that the British made. They thought that if you call a guy a king, put him on a throne, and put a crown on his head, then he's the king. But in Afghanistan, that is not It has nothing to do with it. You know, it's like the king and the throne and the crown and all that is only the emblems of a process that has already taken place, which has to do with marriage alliances, generosity, you know, success in war, favors that you have done back and forth, people you've got in your debt. People build up these kinds of networks of alliances, and it's based on that someone is finally the leader. So when the British brought in 1939, some guy they had in India, he couldn't do it, and later in the late 70s, they brought in a guy, he couldn't do it. What happened in each case was the what?
Not 19th century.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, 18. You have to forgive me, I'm a little, proofreading is my worst skill, and you're probably going to find a lot of these kinds of errors in my book. But in any case, the point I'm making is that each time that they came in and installed somebody that was the official leader according to the British, what happened is that the country fragmented. And it wasn't that the British were not able to conquer Afghanistan. They were. They won every battle, pretty much. They lost a few, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that the country became gradually more and more ungovernable. All right, so now, after the second British invasion, now this is the second period I want to take you guys into. Very pivotal period. The second time the British came in, and when they finally just like, oh my God, this place, I can't stand it, you know, what's going on? Money and lives, and there's just, it's worse than it was when we came in. We got to get out of here. Does anyone in the Afghan world, did any guys want to be king? Yes, somebody did. So he made a deal, and the British said, okay, you're king, and he said, I'll be king, I'll take over, and I will do the one thing that you actually care about. I won't let the Russians in. And in return, there's one thing I'm going to need from you. You don't come in. And here's the line where where the Russians are going to be kept out. It's now the northern border of Afghanistan. And here's the line where you guys are going to not cross. And that's this famous Durand line that until recently still formed the southern eastern border of Afghanistan. And he did all that because he realized that the old days were over, and a guy like him was not going to get the tribes together and go conquer India and do that rhythm that had been seen in this part of the world century after century. No, he knew that there is big powers out there, and that what he had to do was consolidate what he definitely ruled. And so the energies that previous guys would have sent outward into Iran, into India, he directed it inward. He said, I'm conquering my own country. And the borders were now set, the outside powers were staying out, and this guy went to work on his own country. And you know, first of all, his cousins rose up one after another. He fought a war, he beat all those guys. Then whole tribes of Pashtuns, his own ethnic group, but different tribes, they rose up, he went to war, he defeated all of them. Then later on, there was whole ethnic nations, autonomous ethnic nations within these borders. They rose up, he went to war with them, he defeated them, he was supreme. He fought 40 wars in 21 years, and he won every one. And I think that ordinarily, you would suppose that if a guy fights and wins 40 wars in 20 years, that's mostly what he's doing, right? I mean, that seems to make sense. But actually, those wars this guy fought with all the different little tribes and tribal nations within Afghanistan, that was the smaller part of what he did. Because what he really wanted to do was assert his control and his authority from the capital where he was all set up, from the city of Kabul. He wanted to assert his authority on the actual daily lives of all the people within his territory. And there's a sense in which in any modern nation state, that's kind of it's not a single guy, but that's the case. It's a system of laws, a currency, a culture, a language. Everybody's part of it. And here in the United States, when you come to the border with Mexico, you step across, you are in the United States completely and then you step across and you're completely not in the United States, you're totally in Mexico. So he wanted to create something like that in Afghanistan. And the enemy that he faced in this case were these tribal elders, these village elders, and these local clerics, who were not, he could not fight them by fighting and conquering the head of the hierarchy, because there was no head of the hierarchy. He couldn't get to whoever it was that appointed these guys, because there was no one that appointed these guys. Every single one of them was a grassroots guy whose power came from just whoever was around him. So what do you do in that case? That would be fighting, a million wars to fight these guys. So here's what he did. First of all, he gave the directive that each village was supposed to themselves elect a guy he would deal with. So villages were happy to do that. They elected one guy. The king put one of his guys in that area. And the village soon discovered that the person they had elected to deal with the king, his job was to spy on his village and let the king's man know if there was any rebellion in that area. His job was to give each guy a taskira, which is an identity card. It would say who he was, who his father was, where he lived. Thus, every single person, every single male in Afghanistan would be on record in some way or another. He took the country, and it had been, there always had been sort of a division of provinces. So the area of the Hazaras was Hazarajat, and the area of the some other ethnic group was that area, and things were kind of divided up that way. He cut it up into many more districts, and he made sure that every district line cut right across a tribal area, an ethnic area, a clan area, so that people of the same clan always, were under the directive of different government guys, and every government guy had a whole people of a bunch of different clans and tribes in his jurisdiction. He also took tens of thousands of people, many, many families, and moved them back and forth. He took a lot of people from the south and resettled them in the north. He took many people from the north, brought them to the south. He did this, why? Well, I think, to make sure that potential troublemakers would be living amongst people they didn't know, and that would sap them of strength. Stalin did the same thing, and the Assyrians thousands of years ago did the same thing. So he did all of these things. Then he confronted the clerics, and the way he did that was he put them on salary. And the clerics were quite happy to get a salary. And after they were nice and comfortable with their salaries, he said, now, excuse me, but we have to make sure that you really know your religion. So I'm sending inspectors around to test you. Well, 80% of the clerics flunked. So then he was able to say, you're not qualified for your job. If you continue to call yourself a mullah, I'm going to fine you. But you can come to the schools that I set up, and if you graduate from those, then you have a license. So he began to create an alternative network of government mullahs. And by the time he was done, and then, I don't even want to go into the torture and the, all that. Oh, that guy was, I'll quote myself because I can't come up with a better phrase. Next to him, Bismarck would have looked like a wuss. So he was called the Iron Amir in his day. So he did all these things, and he created a complicated, powerful, bureaucratized, totally controlled from the top Afghanistan. And it went down into the village, districts and stuff, but it didn't get down to the bottom. Actually, this old Afghanistan of rural republics and the village, the jirgas and the tribal armies and all of that was still there, and it was still just continually emerging from the top. And there was a point of friction and competition and struggle. And so these two Afghanistans now, in the reign of this guy, definitely came into being. And let me just say this about the upper Afghanistan. That Afghanistan was the one that was able to and interested in looking out, seeing the world, and finding a way to be part of that. Not in the Iron Amir's time. He was concerned with conquering his country, and one of his rules was no railroads in Afghanistan. They just bring the foreigners, just make them easier for them to conquer us. So no railroads. But his descendants, his heirs, the next dynasty that took over, that group was all pointed outwards. And that group wanted to develop the country. And that group wanted to change. And that group wanted to figure out some way that Afghans could have the quality of life, the standards of living that people had in France and England and the United States. So from that time onward, in that urban and pointing towards secular, I'm going to be very careful about saying secular, in that Afghanistan, they started to build roads, build cities, build clinics, build hospitals, build secular schools, set up a radio station, create newspapers, send kids abroad. I just told you one of the first was my father. He married an American. They were a little freaked out about marrying an American. Actually, before he left, they had him and his four buddies come in, and the prime minister said, "Boys, when you're in that other country, don't be messing with the women there." And then when my father married the American woman, they called him right back, and they issued some stiff warnings and told him he was never going to work in this town again. And then gradually the other ones they'd sent also came back with foreign wives, and they realized, man, if we don't say yes to this, our scholarship money is wasted. So they said, okay. Then more American women came. And then, the Cold War happened, and the government was able to parlay its neutrality into money from both sides. They built roads, they built this, that, and the other thing. So there was a process that went from turn of the century to 1970s. This time it is the 1970s. And this process, with some interruptions, was one of building up a modern Afghanistan as a superstructure. And there was a negotiation with the other Afghanistan. Occasionally there were tribal wars and tribal uprisings. But for the most part, these elite rulers of Afghanistan, the aristocrats of Afghanistan, they had a handle on how to deal with the tribal leaders and all that. And in Afghanistan, the Minister of Interior was not the guy who dealt with parks and things like this. He was the opposite number of the foreign minister. He was the diplomat who dealt with the internal leaders. So 70 plus years of progress in that direction, and then it all fell apart. The Soviets, communists seized power, and then the Soviets came in. And then the country was just as destroyed as could possibly be imagined. And that Soviet war, which I think was generally seen in the world at large as Afghans are xenophobic, they don't like invaders, and they're tough to conquer, even Alexander couldn't do it, et cetera, and they coalesce and become united in the face of invaders. Afghans themselves have that sentimental story that they tell themselves. But maybe there's some of that, but in reality, what it is that that Soviet invasion mapped onto the existing struggle in Afghanistan between that old Afghanistan that was squashed by the Iron Amir and the new Afghanistan that he built and his descendants were trying to build. And that competition and struggle, the incipient thing was there all along. And for example, a pivotal moment in that was 1959 when the ruling elite figured out a way to introduce the unveiling of women into Afghan society. That happened, and they did that, but there was always, under the surface, there were tensions about that. And when the Soviets came in, and the uprisings began in the countryside, those uprisings were the descendants of the same uprisings against the modernists that went back to the 1880s. And when the Soviets pursued their war, especially in the mid-80s, when they decided, okay, we gotta finish this thing quick because we're falling apart. This is bleeding us into death. So the idea was that the insurgents were getting their nourishment not from base camps outside the country, which is a standard sort of idea about guerrillas, but their base camps were in the country. They were holing up in villages, and villagers would feed them and stuff. So the Soviets went on a campaign to basically depopulate rural Afghanistan. And the bombing campaign that took place then was just, was out of control, and it drove 6 million Afghans into the refugee camps outside the borders. And it's worth noting that those 6 million Afghans who became refugees, those were not whole families. Those were only the women, children, and old folks of families, and the men went back into the country to fight. So aside from there being so many refugees, it's probably true that every single Afghan rural family was riven in half, and the kind of the feminized portion of the family was in the refugee camps, and the masculine portion of the family was in the country, living for many years in an environment where they were only in the company of men. They were in a world where there was no economy, basically. The only activity was fighting, and the only source of money, both for the communists and the guerrillas in the countryside, was foreign funding coming in. And when the communists finally fell, the rural guerrillas, which had sentimentally been characterized as freedom fighters and this kind of thing, in fact, they were at that time, while they were fighting the Soviets, they were becoming more and more factionalized into ethnic armies, so that when the Soviets and their last communist government finally collapsed, Kabul was a largely depopulated city. It was down to about 300,000, and at that moment, with the last communist president having escaped into the UN building and his government was kaput, there were 11 organized armies, all of them hostile to each other, ringed around the city. And on a certain day, they came in. It wasn't like gradual. There was a certain day when they came in. And they already had discussions and knew that they were going to come as fast as they could, because whatever neighborhoods they got, they would hold. And then, rural Afghanistan had been destroyed in the Soviet war, and urban Afghanistan was destroyed by the Afghans themselves in this civil war. Okay, I actually poked out of the area, the period I was going to tell you guys about. I'm just going to quickly say something about now. We went in and we drove out the Taliban, and we actually did, and I went there in 2002, and I felt like I didn't go all over the country, but wherever I went, the Afghans I met were just so optimistic. They really thought this was the end of 25 years of war. America was here to save us, and everything was going to be great. Things didn't quite go that way, and by 2006, I would say, insurgency was beginning to be a troublesome and pervasive fact of life in the rural countryside. And this was usually, and is still to this day, reported as the resurgence of the Taliban. And that would suggest that what happened was that there was a group was fighting, the West. It was ousted, but then they regrouped, and now they're back. And I think, most people who know anything about this would now agree with me, although, not to boast, but I was saying this first. I was saying this a long time ago. This is not the Taliban of '96 that has regrouped. This is a resurgence of that old Afghanistan, the conservative Afghanistan, the traditional Afghanistan, the village Afghanistan, rendered monstrous by the things that have happened to all of those people in these times. So that they're no longer conservatives, they're reactionaries to the hilt. And the old, you know, the old processes of power, which had a lot to do with tribal alliances and subtle kind of negotiations amongst Afghans, that was disrupted by that period of war when a new brand of leader emerged, and they were the warlords, or the commanders as they called them then. And they were just like any guy with a gun who had 10 other guys with a gun. So those people still exist, and they're all over the place. And since there was no economy, you know, then there was one thing that people could make money from, and that was opium. So now opium is the main cash crop of Afghanistan. And it was a good thing that the war ended and the refugees could come home, but they came home in great numbers and there was nothing for them in the rural areas. So they went to the cities to get jobs. There is no jobs. So the city of Kabul has swelled to over 5 million, I'd say. Nobody really knows how many is there, but and it's impossible to know, you know, because when I was there, one thing I'll tell you is that you can't see the city of Kabul. It's so crowded. It's so I couldn't recognize the city I grew up in at all, even when I was standing right next to something that I could recognize. That's that mosque, but man, you know, I just don't see how this is Kabul. And when you drive out to the edges, you know, my little village, ancestral village, used to be, you know, there was no road to there, and you'd have to take a donkey or a bicycle, and you had to know where you were going, and there was a certain hill you'd go over. Now there's, not only is there a paved road right to that village, not only is that village now, you know, 40 times the size of what it was, but apparently it's already being, you know, negotiated for what people are going to do with their land when the city comes there. Because now it's a suburb. It's a suburb of the city. Soon it'll be in the city. So that's Afghanistan today. Now, I don't know how long I've talked, but I have a feeling it's about 35 minutes. I'm going to end with this. People keep asking me, what does the future look like for Afghanistan? And of course, nobody really knows. But I will say, I have reasons to be very pessimistic and reasons to be very optimistic. Not very optimistic, but I have reasons. I have reasons that I'm, you know, I see positive possibilities. And in these 3 months since my book has been out, every time I'm in a room and I say I see I'm pessimistic in some ways and optimistic in other ways, nobody ever says, "Tell us more about the pessimism." and one reason is, you know, I think most people, they read the news and they can see the pessimism. They just don't know what there could possibly be to be optimistic about. And so I'll just briefly cover that, and then if you guys want to ask questions about it. Yes, it's true that Afghanistan has all this opium and it's criminals and power brokers and warlords and corruption and all that. You hear about that. But Kabul, with its 5 million people, is a city of such big shoulders vigor that it reminded me of New York. It's not a city in which you walk around and see people feeling sorry for themselves. Man, they're just all on the make. They're vigorous and they're out to do something. So there's that. It's really weird how technology has come in and permeated this country. You know, I went out this time some distance from Kabul because we were planting, we were giving bare root trees to villages. It was a project I joined up with. So we were going out, not the areas where the insurgency is heavy, but we were going to rural areas. And out there I see that people have solar panels mounted on their roofs. They get electricity that way. And they've got a satellite dish. And that gives them TV. And they've got these little motorcycles, which I understand both Iran and China have developed these cheap models that every village can afford one. So they've got that. And they send their young men out and they get gas and they come back and they run generators. But also, and this I don't know from experience, but I've read about it. There's remote parts of Afghanistan where there's no road, but there are thundering little creeks and stream beds and rivers. And people have been bringing in hydroelectric small plants, part by part on donkeys. And they've been assembling them in the village, and then they set them up on their stream, and they have just enough, it generates just enough power for their little village or their even portion of a village. And there is, in a place where you can't even drive there, there's 30,000 people who have electricity there from these kinds of little plants, and they've got TVs, and they've got computers, and they're digitizing businesses like woodworking and mud repair of houses. And how do they do that? Because that war drove little boys from this village out to become guerrillas as little kids, then they ended up as refugees, then they ended up growing up in Peshawar or someplace like that, and they learned about computers and they acquired computer skills. Now they've come home, and they, getting home is difficult, but once they're there, they're busy looking for ways to use what they know. So, and I saw this business with the satellite TV and the solar panels myself. But I've talked to people who have gone to places that are much more, that are places I wouldn't go because I'm an old, weak guy that doesn't want to fight right now. So there's braver guys than me that have gone out to those places, and they say that's happening out there too. And the flip side of this opium thing is that the Taliban, I'll just use that term now to mean any of these insurgency kind of guys. One of the ways they fund their campaigns is by selling opium, and they get it from all different places. There's, the guys who grow the opium are the peasants in this system, and they don't want currency. What are they going to do with that? They don't sell their, well, some do, I'm sure, but one of the phenomenon that exists is that they want goods in exchange for their opium. So they're getting like TVs and satellite dish and this technology stuff, they're trading that for opium. So the Taliban, in order to fund their campaign to keep Afghanistan in the 6th century, are bringing the 22nd century into the villages. It's, and those are kinds of processes that nobody can control or deliberately do. And then I'll just end with this one last thing. The government, the parliament, the presidency, all that stuff is pretty iffy in my opinion. But one thing that's very real in the new Afghanistan is media. They have lots of TV stations, private TV stations. They're not government controlled. They're not anyone controlled. And those guys are crusading journalists. They go out and get the story. And I've seen that satellite dishes here can get some of that TV. And I've seen like really interesting discussions about issues of politics and society and culture, and and they have music shows and all that. And now that all those remote villages have these TV sets, so they're seeing that. And part of the separation of this world had been linked to the inaccessibility of the outside world for these little villages. So this thing is going to have effects that we don't know what they are. And that's part of why I'm optimistic. All right, now, do you guys have any questions? Or did I answer everything? Well, women is such a complicated issue, and I always tremble when I begin to approach this question. Because, the situation of women in Afghanistan now is very, they're in a dangerous state. But we hear about the women who are in the urban areas. And we're familiar with legislation that has officially improved a lot of women. But what nobody really knows about or even talks about are the many more women who are not in the urban areas, and they're in the old system and therefore under the control of the men they live with, whose attitudes have grown more ferociously anti, the empowerment and liberation of women. due to this war, and as part of the process of this war. So I think that there's a lot of women in Afghanistan who are in worse shape now than they were in the past. I don't know which past, but I think there is some of that. In the urban areas, a lot of stuff has happened, and there's like many women, I don't know quite how many, but it's like 70 women are in the parliament. And there are women who have, there's a woman who's a governor of a province, and there's women who are doing stuff. But when I was in Kabul and I went to see some of these feminist leaders, I was impressed by how much security they had to leave behind and what the prospects for them will be once the protection is gone. Which is, say what you will about the withdrawal of NATO, whatever side anyone falls on, that's an issue that has to play into it to me, because in these 10 years, the women I'm talking about, they stepped out, they let their names be known, their addresses are known, they came out, they stood up for themselves. And so I would hate to see that they're in danger because of that, and they might be. At the same time, I'll say that, the women that I met and those that I know about that are pursuing political agenda, they're really brave, It's like that takes a lot of courage. It's not like losing your job or whatever. Now, the other thing I'll say, however, is that the Afghanistan I grew up in as a boy was one in which the world was divided into the public realm and the private realm. And the private realm was occupied by men and women, and the public realm was just men. That was just the way it was. In the villages, the women were out in public, but it all has to do with strangers and foreigners. It's foreigners and outsiders are not allowed to see the women of a family. I'll tell you something that happened in 2002 to give you just an example of something. I was sitting around in the foreign ministry with a guy I knew from my village. And he was not a conservative looking guy, he shaved and he had a suit and everything. And I said, so how's your mother? I heard she was not well. And he went, don't talk about my mother. We're in public. Right around that same time, there was a Norwegian journalist who wrote a book called The Bookseller of Kabul. She had been allowed to come there, and the guy said, "You're free to report whatever you want. I'm opening my house to you. You live with us, and say whatever you want." He never dreamt that her book would include pictures of, a description, a vivid description of what his mother looked like naked in the bath. And out in the world, nobody appreciates that was something. And she said, "Hey, you said I could report anything." And I think out here, that was sort of felt like, he did say that. Now he's pulling back, but I don't know. I was offended by that. The underlying hope for Afghan women lies with the introduction of a era of peace in Afghanistan, cultural sovereignty and autonomy in Afghanistan, and a reconciliation of these two Afghanistans. And there was a time when that was happening, and my own lifetime there was towards the very end of that. And my father's life was lived entirely in that. And in that period, the amount of cultural change that took place in Afghanistan, social change that took place in Afghanistan, was absolutely remarkable. And nothing out here even begins to compare to it. And it didn't result in these things that we're talking about, cutting off of noses and beheading women for adultery. I never heard of anything like that when I was there. I feel that in an Afghanistan that was reconciled, it would start going in that direction again, but not while there's war and there's another set of factors in there, which is men saying we're being conquered by outsiders. We're not going to stand for that. And then, you know, much of Afghanistan is inaccessible, and those guys have, you know, they rule the roost where they are, and they can't strike out at the government or at Washington, D.C., but there is someone they can strike out at. It's the women that live in their house. By God, they're not going to get uppity. So, you know, it's like all of that has to be calmed down before something can happen. I just want to say one other thing. It is true that education is the key to all this, but right now, women's education is not happening very much in Afghanistan because there are some schools that girls go to, but the problem is with teachers for those girls, because the culture still has the power to say men can't teach girls, it's got to be women. So bring the women teachers in. But there was that period when women were very hard put to get an education, so that today's women teachers are working hard to stay a grade or two ahead of their kids. So that's a problem. However, there are schools, and I am optimistic that this thing will turn around. What were the benefits of us going in and setting up whatever we set up and installing Karzai for the Afghan people? I would say that there have been benefits, and it's hard to say that there were drawbacks, because compared to how it was, you know, just before we went in, there's no comparison to Afghanistan now. So that, let's just start with that. But most of the benefits, I'd say, it comes from the way that the country has opened up and outside currents have come in. And all of these things I'm telling you about, the technology and the media and all that, that's an offshoot of what we did there. And you know, it was sort of almost, we didn't even know we were doing it, but but we did do it. For a while, there were great benefits, because, you know, for a while, there were people who had known nothing but war, and they put their guns down and went and became shopkeepers. So that actually happened for a while. The apparatus we set up that we called the government, I think there was a flaw in the ointment in all of that. And the first flaw, and perhaps the fatal flaw, was that we set up that government with a jirga. And a jirga, Luya jirga, means the grand meeting of the Afghan tribes. It's an Afghan cultural process. And so we had a meeting like that we called a Luya jirga, but it absolutely was not a Luya jirga. Because in a Luya jirga, you don't know what the end point is. That's what it's for. People will shout and maneuver and politic and connive, and, you know, there will be deal making and bargain. But this one was run like a well-oiled machine. So the very process that was supposed to give Karzai legitimacy did the opposite. He had no legitimacy when he came in. You know, at the time, I thought, well, there's two ways to look at it. Karzai, first of all, had really no authority or prestige in Afghanistan. So he didn't have that thing that Afghan leaders have to have. But on the other hand, everybody who had that was someone who had disgraced themselves with their horrible brutality during the war. And so, you know, they had prestige and followers, but they also had die-hard enemies. So at the time I thought, well, put in a guy like Karzai, nobody really knows who he is, and that might be good. Now Karzai is in the news every day for corruption. He's siphoning fantastic amounts of money into his own for his own uses. But I have to say that when I see what he's doing with that money, well, maybe he's buying cars and villas in Switzerland and stuff. I don't know anything about that. But part of what he's doing is he's paying off warlords and commanders and those people. So what he's doing is building his network for the time afterwards. He's going to step down as president, but he's not gone. He was a nobody when he started, but he's not a nobody now. Whether he's going to be strong enough to prevail, we don't know. You know, My friend Khalid met one of the Karzais in Paris. He said it wasn't one of the ones we've heard about, but there's lots of Karzai brothers. And the guy, after a few drinks, he said, you know, we Karzais, we have artists, we have presidents, we have murderers, we have crooks, we have scoundrels, we have professors, we got everything in the Karzai family. So, and you know, Karzai is not the only guy that's been doing this corruption thing. When I was there staying with an Afghan guy that I'm vaguely related to, he said, well, do you want to see the quarter, Quartier Dozda, the quarter of the thieves quarter? I said, yeah, I don't know what that is, but sure. So we went, and it was just an area with the most magnificent mansions, and those are all the different people who had profited.
Well, Tamim, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming here.
Thank you.